As we enter week 4 of the fantasy football season, fantasy managers everywhere are trying to determine whether they are contenders or pretenders. And one thing that we have learned is that Sam Darnold is indeed not a pretender. We also learned by now that I have no desire to talk about quarterbacks in my weekly starts and sits. Well, at least not a whole heck of a lot. This week, it's all about the running back position, so let's go. Week 4 starts and sits, fantasy football booms. How about Aaron Jones versus the Green Bay Packers? Yes, revenge is a dish best served cold, and you know that Aaron Jones has had this game circled on the calendar for some time. This game is likely the reason why Jones signed with the Vikings in the first place this offseason after being asked by the Packers to take a pay cut or leave. Now, I have learned that you never mess with another man's money, so you know that Jones and his new teammates will have his back in this one, and they will do whatever it takes not only to secure the victory, but also rub a little bit of salt in the wounds of Packers management. What was on paper supposed to be a difficult matchup turned out to be Jones' coming out party for 2024. With 146 total yards against the Texans, the Vikings back is just getting primed for a date with his old team that happens to be allowing 23.27 fantasy points per contest so far, including 3 touchdowns to opposing backs in as many weeks. My second start of the week is Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans taking on the Miami Dolphins. Now, I may be reaching here, or maybe this is wishful thinking, considering that Tony Pollard was limited to just 29 total yards and just 14 yards on the ground on 6 attempts last week. However, let's not just totally dismiss the fact that Pollard did have 196 total yards on 41 opportunities heading into last week's contest. Now, without question, Pollard is the number 1 back for the Titans offense early on. Tajay Spears, he's had just 22 opportunities through 3 weeks. And with a great matchup this week against the Dolphins, Pollard should once again please his fantasy managers who are putting trust back into him. Miami last week, they allowed a pair of touchdowns to Zach Charbonnet, who went on to produce 25 fantasy points in week number 3. That performance is on par from what we've seen from this Dolphins defensive unit, which has been yielding 26.8 fantasy points per game to opposing backs. If Miami continues to struggle offensively, Pollard could see a positive game script leading to more touches, which means more fantasy points. And finally, the third start of the week here for the running back position is Devin Singletary of the New York Giants as they take on the Dallas Cowboys. Admittedly, last week, I had Devin Singletary on my sits list. This week, I am making it up to the Giants back, who accounted for 65 yards in the run game, averaging 4.1 yards per carry, and had 43 additional yards in the passing game on 4 receptions. Singletary could have had a 2-touchdown outing there if he had decided not to go down on the 1-yard line to ice the game. Singletary's decision to give himself up, it was the right call, people. From a team perspective, he wasn't intentionally trying to submarine your fantasy team. He wasn't trying to take fantasy points away from you, and he certainly was not point shaving to help hit the under. Y'all be wild out there thinking this way. Now, currently, Singletary is on pace for 1,116 rushing yards, 51 receptions for 329 yards, and 11 scores. If you all add that up, bippity boppity boo, that would work out to roughly 261.5 fantasy points, which would have been good enough to be the RB7 last season. This season, the Dallas Cowboys, they are allowing 37.8 fantasy points per contest and have already surrendered 546 yards and 7 touchdowns to running backs so far this season. Singletary, he averages 14.2 fantasy points per game, and against this defense, expect that dominance to continue. Now, some running backs that I am not expecting to dominate this week, these are guys who are on my fantasy football bust list, and it starts with Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers taking on the earlier mentioned Minnesota Vikings. Fantasy experts all over owe you an apology for that dud of a performance that we got from Josh Jacobs last week. In a contest in which the Packers put up 30 points, Jacobs finished 3rd in rushing behind Malik Willis and behind Emmanuel Wilson. Jacobs, he may not care about your fantasy team, but we do. Minnesota has allowed the 5th fewest rushing yards to backs this season and the 6th fewest fantasy points on a per game basis. If Jordan Love does return to the Packers this week, then maybe things look a little bit more promising for Jacobs. Maybe he becomes a viable option. Right now, I am not willing to take that chance considering the 85 yards that Wilson had was on 14 touches compared to the 48 produced by Jacobs on his 15 opportunities. A week after a workload type performance there in which Jacobs saw 32 carries, the Packers may have determined that they wanted to lighten the load, but this seems like a significant regression in touches and something that we need to be wary of moving forward. Another running back that I'm sitting this week, J.K. Dobbins against the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, I've been banging that drum to trade J.K. Dobbins for a while now. Last week was a tough matchup on paper, and the Steelers, they didn't disappoint as Dobbins gained just 2.9 yards per carry on his 15 attempts. Things get even more challenging this week facing the AFC West Division rival, the Kansas City Chiefs. Kansas City thus far ranks in the top 5 in terms of rushing yards allowed to backs and the top 10 in receiving yards yielded to the position. From a fantasy perspective, that works out to about 15.77 fantasy points per game, which happens to be the third fewest. With Justin Herbert re-aggravating that ankle injury in that Chargers loss to the Steelers, Dobbins could be facing a negative game script as early as the second quarter. And my final sit of the week, it is Kenneth Walker or Zach Charbonnet. Take your choice here of the Seattle Seahawks as they take on the Detroit Lions. Kenneth Walker missed last week's contest with an oblique injury. Zach Charbonnet, he had a productive outing against the Miami Dolphins in his absence, churning out 91 yards on the ground and a pair of touchdowns on just 18 carries. Miami, they were a top 5 team entering week number 4 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. The Seahawks opponent this week, the Detroit Lions, they are allowing a league low 8.33 fantasy points per game. It doesn't matter if it's Walker or Charbonnet running the ball this week. Detroit has allowed just 138 yards to the running back position on the ground on 50 attempts so far this season. That works out to about 2.8 yards per attempt. They also have allowed just 17 yards in the passing game on 5 receptions thus far. Kyron Williams, 18 carries, 50 yards. Rachaad White, 10 carries, 18 yards, and 1 catch for 5 yards. Then you had James Conner last week, 9 attempts, 17 yards. These are outstanding backs in their own rights, and the Lions are shutting them down. All 3 backs finished 2023 averaging more than 15.5 fantasy points per game. Death, taxes, and benching running backs in fantasy when facing the Lions, those are the only certainties. Well, not quite the only certainties. You can head to RotoBaller.com for all your fantasy football tidbits there. Advice, starts, sits, trades, waiver wires. We got you covered there. And of course, head over to the Discord channel where you'll find me there running that thing 24/7, and we'll see you there. Take care.